The participation of Caribbean soldiers in the British Army during the Second World War and their subsequent migration to Britain is a significant yet often underrepresented chapter in the history of the United Kingdom. These soldiers, coming from various British colonies in the West Indies, played a vital role in the defense of the British Empire, despite the racism and discrimination they faced both during their service and after the war. After the war, many of these soldiers chose to migrate to the UK, contributing to the nation's post-war reconstruction and social landscape. Their story reflects the complexities of identity, loyalty, and the search for belonging in a world that, while being reshaped by war, was still deeply entrenched in colonialism and racial hierarchies. When the Second World War broke out in 1939, the British Empire called upon its colonies for support. Men from the Caribbean responded enthusiastically, enlisting to fight for what many viewed as the mother country. These soldiers came from islands such as Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, and others. They saw the war as an opportunity to demonstrate their loyalty to Britain and as a means of asserting their rights as British subjects. At the time, most Caribbean islands were still colonies, and many men believed that by contributing to the war effort, they would be rewarded with greater political rights and economic opportunities. The recruitment of Caribbean soldiers into the British Army was not an entirely smooth process. Initially, there was hesitation from the British authorities, who were reluctant to recruit large numbers of black soldiers. This reluctance stemmed from deeply ingrained racist attitudes, which viewed black people as inferior and unsuited for military service, especially in combat roles. The British military hierarchy was concerned that arming black men could lead to future demands for equality, both in the Caribbean and within the empire more broadly. Nevertheless, as the war progressed and the need for manpower grew, these racial barriers began to break down, though not completely. Caribbean soldiers were enlisted in various branches of the British military, including the Royal Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. Many were assigned to labor units, where they performed essential but often unglamorous tasks such as loading and unloading supplies, building airfields, and working as mechanics. However, some were able to serve in combat roles. Caribbean airmen, for example, made notable contributions to the RAF, and several Caribbean pilots distinguished themselves during the Battle of Britain and other critical campaigns. The participation of black soldiers from the Caribbean in these roles demonstrated that, despite the prejudices they faced, they were capable of performing just as well as their white counterparts. The experiences of Caribbean soldiers during the war were often marked by racism and discrimination. They were subjected to segregation, with separate facilities for black and white soldiers, and they were frequently assigned menial tasks that were seen as fitting for their race. Black soldiers were also paid less than their white counterparts, despite performing the same duties. Furthermore, interactions between black soldiers and white civilians, particularly white women, were often met with hostility and suspicion. The notion of racial hierarchy was deeply entrenched in British society, and these attitudes extended to the treatment of black soldiers. However, for many Caribbean soldiers, the war was also a transformative experience. It exposed them to different cultures and ideas, and it challenged the racial boundaries that had been imposed on them. Many soldiers formed friendships with white soldiers, particularly those from working-class backgrounds, who were often more open to socializing across racial lines. Some Caribbean soldiers also found that their presence in Britain, where the war effort created a sense of shared purpose, offered more opportunities for social mobility than they had experienced in their home islands. These experiences of service, both positive and negative, would profoundly shape the post-war lives of many Caribbean veterans. After the war ended in 1945, many Caribbean soldiers were demobilized and returned to their home islands. However, the economic conditions in the Caribbean were dire. The islands had been economically dependent on Britain for centuries, and the war had further weakened their already fragile economies. Jobs were scarce, and many veterans found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. They had returned home, expecting that their service would be rewarded with greater opportunities, but instead, they found that little had changed. The colonial administration remained indifferent to their sacrifices, and the social hierarchies that existed before the war were still intact. Faced with limited prospects in the Caribbean, many veterans began to consider migration to Britain. They had seen firsthand during the war that Britain, despite its problems, offered more opportunities for economic advancement and social mobility than their home countries. In 1948, the British government passed the British Nationality Act, which granted all citizens of the British Empire the right to live and work in Britain. This legal change, combined with the severe labor shortages in Britain after the war, prompted a wave of migration from the Caribbean to the UK. The arrival of Caribbean migrants in Britain in the late 1940s and early 1950s marked the beginning of a new chapter in the relationship between the Caribbean and the UK. Many of the early migrants were former soldiers who had served in the British Army during the war. These men had a sense of belonging to Britain, and they believed that their contributions to the war effort would be recognized. However, upon arrival, they quickly discovered that Britain was not as welcoming as they had hoped. The post-war migration of Caribbean veterans and other Caribbean migrants was met with hostility and racism from many white Britons. The British economy was struggling to recover from the devastation of the war, and there was fierce competition for jobs and housing. Caribbean migrants, like their counterparts from India, Pakistan, and other former colonies, were often scapegoated for these economic problems. Many white Britons viewed the influx of black and brown people as a threat to their way of life, and Caribbean migrants faced discrimination in housing, employment, and education. The color bar, which had existed in the British Army during the war, continued to exist in civilian life. Caribbean migrants, however, were not passive victims of this discrimination. They organized and resisted the racism they encountered, both individually and collectively. Many former soldiers, in particular, were determined to assert their rights as British subjects and to demand fair treatment. They had fought for Britain during the war, and they were not willing to accept second-class status in the country they had defended. Caribbean veterans played a key role in the emerging civil rights movement in Britain, which sought to challenge racial discrimination and secure equal rights for all citizens, regardless of race. One of the most significant moments in the struggle for racial equality in Britain came in 1958, with the Notting Hill riots in London. These riots were sparked by tensions between Caribbean migrants and white Britons, and they exposed the deep racial divisions that existed in British society. Many of the Caribbean migrants involved in the riots were former soldiers who had come to Britain with high hopes, but had been disillusioned by the racism they faced. The riots were a turning point in British race relations, as they forced the government and the public to confront the reality of racial discrimination in the country. Despite the challenges they faced, Caribbean migrants made significant contributions to post-war British society. They helped rebuild the country's infrastructure, working in industries such as transportation, construction, and healthcare. Many Caribbean women, in particular, played a crucial role in the National Health Service, which was established in 1948. Caribbean veterans and migrants also contributed to British culture, particularly in the fields of music, art, and literature. The sounds of calypso, reggae, and ska, for example, became an integral part of the British musical landscape and Caribbean writers and artists challenged the narrow, Eurocentric definitions of Britishness. Over time, the presence of Caribbean veterans and migrants in Britain led to a gradual shift in public attitudes towards race and immigration. While racism and discrimination persisted, there was also growing recognition of the contributions that Caribbean people had made to British society. By the 1960s, the civil rights movement in Britain had gained momentum, and there were increasing demands for legislation to address racial discrimination. The Race Relations Act of 1965 was a landmark piece of legislation that made it illegal to discriminate on the grounds of race in public places. This act, and the broader movement for racial equality, owed much to the efforts of Caribbean veterans and migrants who had fought not only for Britain during the war, but also for their rights as British citizens in the post-war period. The participation of Caribbean soldiers in the British Army during the Second World War and their subsequent migration to Britain is a story of loyalty, sacrifice, and resilience. These men fought for the British Empire, believing that their service would be rewarded with greater rights and opportunities. However, after the war, they faced racism and discrimination, both in the Caribbean and in Britain. Despite these challenges, Caribbean veterans and migrants played a vital role in the reconstruction of post-war Britain and in the fight for racial equality. Their legacy is one of perseverance and determination, and it serves as a reminder of the complex and often painful history of empire, migration, and race in Britain. If you like this video and know someone in the military, please share it with them. Thank you for watching.